The shadow of the bomb. Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. I speak, you listen. We are going to talk about a war unlike any other in human history. A conflict that spanned nearly 5 decades, was fought on every continent, yet saw the principal adversaries never fire a direct shot at each other. It was a war of spies, of satellite launches, of subtle political maneuvers, and of terrifying nuclear arsenals. A war fought not with tanks, but with ideas. It was the Cold War. It wasn't a military battle between nations, but an existential battle between two visions for humanity's future. It was a global high-stakes game of chess, where the price of a single wrong move was annihilation. The year is 1945. The bloodiest conflict the world had ever known is finally over. The Allies, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union have defeated the Axis powers. Cities are in ruins, millions are dead, but a fragile peace has descended upon the globe. It should have been a moment of shared triumph. Instead, it was merely the intermission before the main event. The two superpowers, ideological divide. The two nations that emerged from World War II as undisputed global superpowers were the United States and the Soviet Union, and they were diametrically opposed. On one side stood the United States and the West, championing capitalism and democracy, the belief that individual liberty, free markets, and multi-party elections were the only path to prosperity. On the other side was the Soviet Union, the world's first true communist state, championing communism and a totalitarian single-party system, the belief that private property must be abolished, that the state must control all means of production, and that history was inevitably leading to a global, classless society. The only thing these two nations had in common was their distrust of each other and their unprecedented military power. From allies to adversaries, the seeds of conflict. The seeds of the Cold War were sown long before 1947. Even as they fought, Hitler, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were deeply suspicious of one another's post-war aims. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, they began carving up the world. Stalin had suffered immense losses and demanded a sphere of influence. In Eastern Europe, a buffer zone to prevent future invasions. He installed loyal communist regimes across Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, blocking free elections. This move was seen in the West not as a defensive measure, but as the first act of global communist expansion. In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, speaking in Missouri, delivered the famous line that would define the decades to come. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The Iron Curtain was now drawn, and the world was officially divided. The defining doctrine, containment. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman faced the terrifying reality of Soviet power. He adopted the policy that would define America's strategy for the next 40 years, containment. The goal was simple: to contain the spread of communism, stopping it from pushing further into Western Europe, Asia, or anywhere else. This policy gave birth to two vital initiatives: the Truman Doctrine, 1947, the commitment to provide military and economic aid to any nation threatened by communist takeover, first applied to Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan, 1948, billions of dollars poured into rebuilding Western European economies. The goal was to make these nations so prosperous and stable that communism would hold no appeal to their citizens. The Soviet Union countered by creating the Cominform, ensuring political loyalty in the Eastern Bloc. The stage was set. The ideological lines were drawn. The powers were armed. What began as a disagreement over territory and governance was rapidly spiraling into a systemic, global competition, a Cold War where every political crisis, every scientific discovery, and every revolution was viewed through the lens of East versus West. That is where our story truly begins. The first clash and the hardening of blocs, 1948 to 1953. Crisis in Berlin. The first test, 1948. The front lines of the Cold War were not in some far-flung jungle, but deep inside Soviet-occupied Germany, in a single, ruined city, Berlin. Germany, the defeated enemy, had been carved into 4 zones of occupation. but its capital, Berlin, also divided into 4 sectors, lay 100 miles deep inside the Soviet zone. For the Western Allies, the US, Britain, and France, West Berlin was a lonely island of capitalism and democracy, floating in a vast communist sea. It was a constant, irritating showcase of Western prosperity right behind the Iron Curtain. For Stalin, it was an intolerable affront. The flashpoint came in June 1948. The Western Allies, pushing forward with the economic recovery promised by the Marshall Plan, introduced a new, stable currency, the Deutschmark, into their sectors of Germany and West Berlin. Stalin saw this as the final step toward a permanent, separate West German state. His response was immediate, aggressive, and absolute. On June 24, 1948, the Soviets cut off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin. They shut off the electricity supply from the Soviet sector. Stalin's intention was clear: starve the Western Allies out. The nearly 2 million citizens of West Berlin were given a terrible ultimatum: either accept Soviet control or perish. This was the first true test of the containment policy. Would the West abandon West Berlin to avoid war? The Berlin airlift, Operation Vittles. President Truman refused to abandon the city, but forcing an armed convoy through the Soviet blockade would mean certain war. The only solution remaining was one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the 20th century: the Berlin airlift, codenamed Operation Vittles. The strategy was simple in theory, impossible in practice: supply an entire major city exclusively by air. American and British aircrews began flying relentless, non-stop missions, the Raisin, bombers, delivering everything from flour and medical supplies to coal for heat and power. Planes landed every few minutes, day and night, in a terrifyingly tight rotation. At its peak, an average of 8,000 tons of supplies were flown into West Berlin every single day. Pilots, many of whom had fought against Germany only a few years earlier, were now hailed as heroes by the German population. This was a psychological victory as much as a logistical one. It was a demonstration of Western resolve without firing a single shot. The Soviets had miscalculated, believing the Allies would fold within weeks. But the airlift proved that Western determination could bypass their land-based aggression. After 11 months, faced with the embarrassing failure of his blockade, Joseph Stalin relented. On May 12, 1949, the roads, rails, and canals were reopened. The Cold War had seen its first victory, and it belonged to the West. 2 worlds, 2 alliances. The shock of the Berlin Blockade cemented the necessity of a formal military alliance for the West. The United Nations, designed to maintain peace, was already paralyzed by the Soviet veto in the Security Council. If the Soviets were willing to starve a city, the West needed a concrete deterrent. In April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established. It was founded on a revolutionary principle: collective defense. Its famous Article 5 stated that an attack on one member nation would be considered an attack on all of them. This was the ultimate security guarantee, binding the immense military power of the United States to the defense of Western Europe. For the Soviet Union, the formation of NATO, and the later inclusion of West Germany in 1955, was the ultimate provocation. In response, they formed their own collective defense treaty in 1955, the Warsaw Pact. Europe was now split into 2 hostile, heavily armed, nuclear-capable camps. The line drawn by the Iron Curtain was now backed by 2 massive, opposing military machines. The division of the world was no longer a theory. It was a military structure: the Atomic Shadow and NSC-68. Just as the global structure was hardening, the geopolitical balance was shattered. In August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. The US monopoly on nuclear weapons was over. The game had changed overnight. No longer could the US threaten nuclear retaliation without risking nuclear devastation at home. The concept of mutual assured destruction, or MAD, was born. 2 nations now had the power to end human civilization. This terrifying development led the Truman administration to commission a secret and pivotal report, NSC-68, released in 1950. It argued for a massive, unprecedented military buildup. The US would no longer simply contain communism. It would outspend it, outbuild it, and outfight it on every conceivable front, preparing for a long, global twilight struggle. The policy of containment was about to face its first bloody, non-European challenge. The Hot War, Korea, 1950. While Europe was the focus of ideological tension, the first genuine military battle of the Cold War ignited on a peninsula in Asia, Korea. After World War II, Korea, like Germany, had been divided, temporarily, along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union supported a communist government in the north, led by Kim Il-sung. The US backed an anti-communist government in the south. On a quiet Sunday morning in June 1950, the North Korean People's Army, heavily armed with Soviet tanks and weapons, swept across the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion of South Korea. To President Truman, this was not a civil war. It was the clearest act of Soviet-backed expansion since the Berlin Blockade, testing the West's resolve in a new arena. The United States immediately pushed the issue to the United Nations. Crucially, the Soviet delegate was absent, boycotting the Security Council over the exclusion of Communist China. This massive strategic blunder allowed the UN to pass a resolution condemning the invasion and creating a United Nations command to defend South Korea. American and Allied troops, led by General Douglas MacArthur, were rushed into the desperate defense of the South. What followed was 3 years of savage, seesaw warfare, a hasty retreat to the Pusan perimeter, the daring Incheon landing that turned the tide, and the disastrous advance toward the Yalu River that triggered a mass intervention by Communist China. The Korean War was brutal. It was fought not for victory, but for a stalemate. When the armistice was finally signed in 1953, the border was essentially back where it started, at the 38th parallel. But the message of the Korean War was definitive. The Cold War would be fought with hot blood and real casualties, but rarely by the two superpowers directly. It set the grim precedent for the proxy wars that would plague the globe for decades. The world had been officially divided, militarized, and nuclearized. The stage was set for the decade of tension, brinkmanship, and espionage that followed. Brinkmanship and the apex of crisis, 1954 to 1962. The doctrine of brinkmanship and massive retaliation. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War had a new shape, guided by the strategies of US President Dwight D. Eisenhower and his uncompromising Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Dulles coined the term brinkmanship. It meant pursuing a policy of pushing a dangerous conflict or event to the very brink of disaster to achieve the most advantageous outcome. It was a high-stakes game of chicken with the fate of the world. This aggressive posture was rooted in the concept of massive retaliation. The US, wary of getting dragged into endless, expensive ground wars like Korea, declared that any major Soviet or communist aggression would be met not with conventional forces, but with an immediate and overwhelming response, likely using nuclear weapons. The US was now integrating the nuclear threat into its foreign policy as a first resort, not a last. The Soviet Union, now led by the bombastic and unpredictable Nikita Khrushchev after Stalin's death in 1953, was catching up quickly. Both sides engaged in a frantic nuclear arms race, developing ever more powerful thermonuclear weapons, H-bombs. The primary delivery method became the ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. These missiles could carry a nuclear warhead thousands of miles, eliminating the need for bombers and drastically cutting the warning time. The world suddenly felt much, much smaller. The space race, Sputnik and the missile gap. The Cold War competition was not limited to tanks and spies. It extended into the heavens. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. The physical satellite was small, transmitting only a simple, insistent beep 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 across the globe. But its psychological impact was monumental. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into space, it meant they possessed the powerful rocket technology, necessary to launch ICBMs at the United States. Americans feared a missile gap, the belief that the Soviets had surpassed the US in missile production. Sputnik triggered immediate panic and a frantic mobilization in the US. NASA was created to coordinate the space effort. Massive funding was poured into scientific research and education. NDEA, National Defense Education Act. The race was on. For the next decade, achievements in space, from orbiting the Earth to landing on the Moon, became direct measures of ideological superiority and technological prowess. Escalation, the U-2 incident. 1960. Despite the rise of ICBMs, espionage remained vital. The US was using high-altitude spy planes, the U-2, to fly undetected deep over Soviet territory, taking photographs of military installations and missile sites. The U-2 flights were essential in determining that the missile gap was actually a myth. The Soviets were far behind. In May 1960, just weeks before a critical summit in Paris that promised to reduce tensions, disaster struck. A Soviet surface-to-air missile successfully shot down American pilot Francis Gary Powers and his U-2 spy plane deep inside Soviet airspace. Khrushchev, seizing the opportunity, personally announced the capture of the plane and the pilot. President Eisenhower was initially forced to lie, claiming it was a weather plane that had strayed off course. But when Khrushchev produced the living pilot and the plane's high-tech camera, Eisenhower was forced to admit the truth. The Paris summit collapsed. Trust evaporated. The incident confirmed the deep hostility between the leaders and highlighted the extreme lengths both sides would go to for information, regardless of the risk of war. The Berlin Wall, 1961. By 1961, the city of Berlin was still the most volatile flashpoint. While the Iron Curtain stopped nearly all movement across Eastern Europe, West Berlin remained a gaping hole. Since the formation of the two Germanys, nearly 3.5 million East Germans, including some of the nation's best educated workers and professionals, had fled communism. By simply walking into West Berlin and catching a flight to West Germany, this drain of talent and manpower was crippling the East German economy. Nikita Khrushchev, frustrated by the new American president, John F. Kennedy, and desperate to stop the hemorrhaging of his satellite state, took drastic action. In the early morning hours of August 13, 1961, East German soldiers and construction workers began erecting a barrier of barbed wire and concrete blocks, quickly evolving into the formidable Berlin Wall. The wall was built to keep people in, not out. It was a visible, concrete symbol of the failure of the communist economic and political system. It brutally divided neighborhoods, families, and friends, and would stand as the ugly scar of the Cold War for the next 28 years. The world watched, stunned, but the West could only protest. Direct military intervention to stop the construction of the wall would have meant war, and the risk was deemed too high. October 1962, 13 days of terror. All the tensions, the nuclear arms race, the brinkmanship, the proxy conflict, and the personal rivalry between Kennedy and Khrushchev converged in October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the moment. The Cold War went from dangerous to terrifyingly close to extinction. In 1959, communist revolutionary Fidel Castro had overthrown the US-backed regime in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. After the disastrous US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion attempt in 1961, Castro turned firmly to the Soviet Union for security. In mid-October 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba photographed undeniable evidence. The Soviet Union was secretly deploying medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles, capable of striking the majority of the continental United States in minutes. Kennedy and his advisors were horrified. The strategic balance was fundamentally upset. The US had missiles in Turkey aimed at the USSR. Now the Soviets had missiles in Cuba aimed at the US. The resolution: Kennedy resisted pressure for an immediate, full-scale invasion of Cuba, which would have certainly triggered the use of the missiles already there. Instead, he announced a quarantine, a naval blockade, of Cuba. demanding the removal of the offensive weapons. He declared that any missile launched from Cuba would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring full retaliatory response. The world held its breath as Soviet ships carrying more missile components steamed toward the blockade line. For 13 days, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. Military readiness was at DEFCON 2, one step away from nuclear war. Finally, through intense, back-channel negotiations between Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador, a compromise was reached. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. The US publicly agreed never to invade Cuba. Secretly, the US agreed to remove its own obsolete missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, not through massive retaliation, but through a terrifying show of restraint and diplomacy. It was a profound lesson for both sides. Nuclear war was not a viable policy tool. It was an extinction event. Lessons learned. The most immediate outcome of the crisis was the installation of the Moscow-Washington hotline in 1963, a direct teletype link between the Kremlin and the White House. This ensured that in future crises, leaders could communicate directly and immediately, rather than relying on slow, confusing diplomatic cables. The terrifying near miss ushered in a new era of relative calmness, known as détente, a relaxation of tension. The race to annihilate continued, but both sides began to seek ways to manage the conflict, rather than constantly escalating it. The focus shifted from outright confrontation to competition in different arenas, and the world was about to witness the horrors of the next massive proxy war. Vietnam, détente and global proxy conflicts, 1963 to 1979. The thaw, the era of détente. The crisis in Cuba forced both superpowers to recognize a chilling reality. They were not immune to miscalculation, and miscalculation meant global destruction. The immediate aftermath brought about the era of détente, a French term meaning the easing of strained relations. Détente was not peace, but it was a commitment to manage the rivalry to prevent a nuclear apocalypse. In 1963, the first major step was taken, the Limited Test Ban Treaty. It banned nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space, forcing testing underground. It was a small but crucial agreement to slow the arms race and limit the environmental fallout. The most visible period of détente occurred under U.S. President Richard Nixon and Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev. They understood that a stable relationship was vital for domestic reasons. The arms race was enormously expensive and draining both economies. Diplomacy and arms control. Nixon's foreign policy, guided by Henry Kissinger, was revolutionary. In 1972, Nixon undertook his historic trip to China, a massive ideological rival to the US, but also a geopolitical rival to the Soviet Union. By opening relations with Communist China, the US gained leverage over the USSR, a policy often described as playing the China card. The same year, Nixon traveled to Moscow. This era produced the landmark Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT-I. SALT-I accomplished two key things. It placed temporary limits on the number of strategic ballistic missile launches, ICBMs and SLBMs, each side could possess. It signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile, ABM, Treaty, which restricted the construction of missile defense systems. The grim logic here was that if one side could defend itself, it might be tempted to launch a first strike. By agreeing to remain mutually vulnerable, they ensured mutual assured destruction. MAD remained the deterrent. Détente was cemented with the Helsinki Accords in 1975, where 35 nations formally accepted the post-war boundaries in Europe. The Soviets gained legitimacy for their control over Eastern Europe, while the West gained Soviet pledges to respect human rights within their borders, a subtle weapon the West would use later. The quagmire, the Vietnam War, 1964 to 1975, even as leaders signed treaties in glamorous capitals. The Cold War was raging in the rice paddies of Southeast Asia. Vietnam was the defining, devastating proxy conflict of this era. The US commitment to Vietnam was rooted firmly in the domino theory, the fear that if South Vietnam fell to communism, all the surrounding nations, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and beyond would fall too. US involvement escalated dramatically under President Lyndon B. Johnson, following the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were fighting a grueling, unwinnable guerrilla war against the Communist Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, both heavily supplied by the Soviet Union and China. The Vietnam War was a global event. It wasn't just a military conflict. It was a televised war that brought the horrors of combat directly into American living rooms, fueling massive anti-war movements and profound domestic unrest. The Tet Offensive in 1968, though a military defeat for the North Vietnamese, was a massive psychological victory. It shattered the American public's belief that the war was winnable. Ultimately, the political cost became too high. Under President Nixon, the US began a policy of Vietnamization, slowly withdrawing American combat troops while trying to bolster the South Vietnamese army. By 1973, US involvement officially ended. 2 years later, in 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, and Vietnam was unified under a communist government. The US had failed to contain communism in this critical region. The war cost over 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives, shattering American faith in its government and its military infallibility. Global expansion, the Third World battleground. With the superpowers locked in a nuclear stalemate in Europe, their rivalry shifted aggressively into the decolonizing world. The nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often collectively called the Third World. Decolonization created dozens of newly independent, often fragile, states ripe for ideological influence. The US and the USSR competed fiercely, pouring in massive amounts of economic and military aid to secure loyalty and resources. These regions became the primary theaters for proxy wars. Key flashpoints of this global struggle included Angola, 1975A, massive civil war where the Soviet Union and Cuba backed one communist faction, while the US and South Africa backed rival groups. Chile, 1973. The US covertly supported the military coup that overthrew the democratically elected Marxist President Salvador Allende, highlighting the US's willingness to undermine democracy if a communist victory was feared. The Middle East, a complex web of conflicts, particularly the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where the US supported Israel and the Soviets supported the Arab states, nearly escalating tensions back to a Cuban Missile Crisis level. The end of the thaw. By the late 1970s, the careful balance of détente began to crumble. In the Soviet Union, the economy was stagnant. The vast spending required for the military and space competition, coupled with the rigid, centralized control of agriculture and industry, was pushing the system toward crisis. The Soviet leadership, led by the aging Brezhnev, was becoming increasingly rigid and paranoid about internal dissent. In the US, the public and Congress began to mistrust the process. Many felt détente allowed the Soviets to build up their conventional military while securing the moral victory of the Helsinki Accords. The final hammer blow to détente came in 1979. In December 1979, the Soviet Union, concerned about a decaying Marxist regime on its border, ordered a massive military invasion of Afghanistan. This was seen in the West as the final, unforgivable act of Soviet expansionism, directly violating the spirit of peaceful coexistence that détente was supposed to represent. US President Jimmy Carter responded immediately. He imposed a crippling grain embargo on the Soviet Union, pulled the US team out of the 1980 Moscow Summer Olympics, and dramatically increased military spending. Détente was officially dead. The Cold War, which had briefly warmed, plunged back into a deep freeze. A new, more aggressive era of confrontation was about to begin, led by a new generation of Western leaders determined not just to contain communism, but to defeat it. The final act, collapse, 1980 to 1991. The Second Cold War, confrontation, 1980s. The beginning of the 1980s marked a sharp departure from the negotiated caution of détente. The invasion of Afghanistan, coupled with the continued economic struggles in the West, ushered in a period often called the Second Cold War. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became President of the United States. His approach was fundamentally different from his predecessors. He was not content simply to manage the Soviet Union. He aimed to win the Cold War. Reagan rejected the concept of moral equivalence, the idea that both superpowers were equally responsible for the conflict. He viewed the Soviet Union with uncompromising ideological clarity, famously calling it the evil empire in 1983. Reagan initiated the largest peacetime military buildup in American history, convinced that the Soviet economy could not sustain a renewed arms race. The new strategy was peace through strength. The most ambitious and controversial aspect of this buildup was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Quickly dubbed Star Wars by critics, SDI proposed a complex space-based defense shield designed to shoot down incoming Soviet ICBMs. While SDI was heavily criticized by scientists and never fully developed, its announcement had a devastating psychological effect on the Kremlin. Soviet leaders believed that the US was genuinely close to achieving the shield, which would neutralize their nuclear deterrent and force them to bankrupt their own failing economy, trying to keep pace with a technology they couldn't afford. The economic pressure was now immense, forcing the Soviet system to the breaking point. The Polish challenge and Pope John Paul II. While the US was pressuring the USSR from the outside, the empire was cracking from within. The most significant internal challenge came from Poland. In the Gdansk shipyards, a workers' movement led by electrician Lech Walesa formed Solidarność, in 1980. This was the first officially recognized non-communist trade union in a Warsaw Pact nation. It represented a massive popular rejection of the state-controlled system. Simultaneously, the election of Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyla as Pope John Paul II provided a massive moral challenge to the communist regime. When the Pope visited Poland, he drew millions of worshippers, proving that the Catholic faith, and not communism, held the true moral authority over the Polish people. Solidarity demonstrated that if the people pushed hard enough, the brittle communist regimes could crack. The Kremlin watched nervously, realizing that the old tool, sending in tanks, as they did in Czechoslovakia, 1968, or Hungary, 1956, might no longer be viable against such a massive, unified movement. Gorbachev and the reformers. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet leadership was dying off. The aging, conservative leaders were replaced by a younger, more dynamic figure in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev knew the Soviet system was failing economically and socially. He launched two radical policies to save it. Glasnost, openness. This involved reducing censorship, allowing free speech, and encouraging public debate about the nation's problems, hoping to inject new ideas into the stagnant Communist Party. Perestroika, restructuring. This involved economic reforms, introducing limited free market principles, decentralizing economic planning, and allowing small private businesses, in an attempt to spark economic growth. Gorbachev also understood that to save the economy, he had to end the arms race. He began reaching out to Reagan, even as Reagan famously challenged him during a 1987 visit to Berlin. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The end of the arms race. The Reykjavik summit in 1986 and subsequent meetings were pivotal. Gorbachev was willing to make unprecedented concessions. In 1987, the two leaders signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty, eliminating all ground-launched nuclear missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. It was the first treaty to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons, moving beyond mere limitations. Crucially, Gorbachev also stated that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene militarily to prop up communist regimes in Eastern Europe, effectively ending the Brezhnev Doctrine. He hoped the local communist leaders would embrace reform. This decision, more than any other, sealed the fate of the Eastern Bloc. The dominoes fall, 1989. With the Soviet guarantee of protection removed, the people of Eastern Europe realized their fear was gone. The dam broke in 1989. In Poland, solidarity was legalized and overwhelmingly won elections. In Hungary, the border with Austria was opened, creating a massive escape route for East Germans. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution brought down the communist regime peacefully. In Romania, the overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu was violent. The climax came in Berlin. On November 9, 1989, due to a confused and hasty press conference by an East German official, the public wrongly assumed the borders were immediately open. Thousands flocked to the wall, confronted by the massive crowds and lacking orders from Moscow to shoot. The guards had no choice. The Berlin Wall fell. People crossed freely for the first time in 28 years, symbolizing the end of the Iron Curtain and the ultimate failure of communism. The Soviet collapse, 1991. Gorbachev's reforms saved the world from the Cold War but failed to save the Soviet Union. Glasnost revealed the depth of the corruption and economic misery, fueling nationalist movements in the Soviet republics, Ukraine, the Baltic states, etc., who now demanded independence. Perestroika was too little, too late. In August 1991, hardline communist officials, desperate to halt the reforms and the breakup of the USSR, staged a coup attempt in Moscow. It failed spectacularly, largely due to the democratic resistance led by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic. The failed coup destroyed Gorbachev's authority and accelerated the demands for independence. One by one, the Soviet republics declared themselves sovereign. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus declared that the Soviet Union no longer existed. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned his post, a post that no longer existed. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the final time. It was replaced by the flag of the Russian Federation. The Cold War was over. It did not end with a decisive battle, but with the collapse of the Soviet economy, the moral exhaustion of its ideology, and the resolute will of the people demanding freedom. The legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War defined a generation. It gave us the constant shadow of nuclear anxiety, the technological leap of the space race, and a global network of security alliances like NATO that persist to this day. It fundamentally reshaped the world, turning ideological differences into global battle lines. We learned that the cost of an unwinnable war, whether hot or cold, is immense, measured not just in treasury, but in trust, lives, and moral authority. The ultimate victory of the West was a testament to the resilience of democratic institutions and the dynamism of market economies, which ultimately proved superior to rigid central planning and authoritarian control. But the end of the Cold War did not mean the end of conflict. The sudden disappearance of the Soviet Union created a power vacuum, replacing the predictable two-player world with a complex, unstable multipolar world filled with new threats, terrorism, regional conflicts, and the resurgence of old ethnic and nationalist hatreds. Today, many of the geopolitical tensions we face, from the relationship with Russia to the rise of China, are direct descendants of the strategies, technologies, and alliances forged during that 45-year twilight struggle. The Cold War may be over, but its legacy is the foundation upon which the 21st century world is built. Fade to black.